specifically, tangibly, economic inclusion. So we're delighted. She's a personal friend, a professional friend, and one of the best in the nation. Let's please welcome back to Omaha, Miss Tawanna Black.
I'm all mic'd up.
You got it? All right.
I'm all good. Well, hello, Omaha. It's wonderful to be back home. I'll call this home. Don't tell anybody in Kansas. I said that was home when I was home last week. But it's wonderful to be able to be back here with you all. I am so inspired and touched by the amazing progress and growth of the work of the Empowerment Network. Please give it up for Willie and the entire board and organization for all of the work that has happened here. Today has been phenomenal. All of the speakers, all of the panelists, all of the staff and volunteers of the network are truly killing it. And not just because of the event and the professional level of today, but because of the work that is happening here, because of the progress that started a number of years ago, as Willie said, meeting every Saturday morning, people sacrificing their time and their energy, their passion and their commitment, because they believed that not only was it possible, but it was imperative to create a community where people were not only living better, but thriving better together. Not only did kids have jobs, but have a real opportunity, a reach, and a promise of true economic opportunity and wealth, moving beyond that place of having jobs and security, but that actual opportunity to have wealth, to reclaim the promise and the prosperity of the legends that we've been celebrating all day today. And so I am beyond thrilled and honored and anticipate having some Minneapolis and Minnesota residents here next year as you have Magic here celebrating with you. Absolutely, absolutely. Cannot wait to be able to go back home there and tell them so that with us next year. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about what we're doing at the Center for Economic Inclusion, why I felt the need to be able to create an organization in the city that I call home now for almost 10 years, and what we're doing and why we're doing that, not only in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, but across the country, and what that imperative is, why it's necessary to reshape our efforts to not only pursue employment and income changes for people who look like us and other brown people across our country, but to really have that narrative begin to shift and the actions begin to shift and the promise shift to being about wealth, how we're doing that, how we're disrupting that across all sectors, and a little bit about what we've seen and what we're experiencing, and invite you into that work of fueling economic and shared prosperity. I'm giving you Twitter handles on the screen because I invite you to continue the dialogue with us there, to Google, to share it online, and then to continue that dialogue with us far beyond today as well. So let's jump on in because we are deep into the hour of the day, and I know there are lots of receptions through tonight, and I look forward to being able to engage with you there as well. So the story, a lot of people today have asked me if I love Minnesota and Minneapolis, and if you knew me before, I have not changed. I'm still pretty honest, and so people have been shocked when I'm like, yes, because of these numbers that you see on the screen before you. Life in Minnesota for people who are like us is not much different than it is here. Bigger city, but no different in terms of statistics. We are a city where Black and brown households find themselves struggling, and over the last several years, many organizations, many people, policymakers, decision makers, and business leaders have been moving the needle, and yet the needle has not been moving. And so while we find that median household income is up and Black and brown households are making progress, they're not really making progress. And we see those gains are moving forward from an income perspective. When we look at actual wealth building, we find that those households are not actually making progress, because when you start further from the bottom and when economic opportunity is rising at the rates that it's rising in the Twin Cities, we are known for being the best at just about everything in Minnesota. When businesses are thriving at the rate that they're thriving, when household prices are thriving at the rate that they are thriving, and we are so far from being able to reach those things. Just making a little bit more money, just getting a little better job is not nearly enough. And so we find ourselves saying, wait just a minute, that's not good enough. And yet the case for economic inclusion isn't just that black folks are getting jobs but not getting good jobs. The case for economic inclusion is that when we don't get those good jobs, it hurts everybody. And that is the case that we're making in our region. If you see the data on your screen, it comes from the Brookings Institution. It is the Metro Monitor data that is produced every year for most of the largest cities in our country. And this data helps us start to analyze not just what's happening as it relates to black and brown people, though that's really important, but it also helps us start to say what's happening for the entire economy. And when we look at this data, we see that, wait a minute, cities like ours have for too long thought about those issues impacting communities of color as being about a little bit of a handout, a little bit of a hand up, a little bit of charity, and haven't stopped to think about, wait a minute. The longer we talk about those numbers, the longer we talk about the labor shortage, and we talk about the numbers of people of color that are growing, but don't talk about it in terms of the economic talent that is left on the sidelines, the longer we do ourselves a disservice as an entire country and an entire economy. So the data you show on the screen is showing that our economy is starting to dip because we are not valuing that talent. We're not capturing that talent. Not just from okay, we need to get them off the sidelines and into the workplace. That's important. But because we need to get that intelligence deployed. We need to understand what they know about our customer base and be sure that they're informing our strategies. Not just a little bit. We've heard the stories in all the diversity and inclusion classes, and as somebody who used to sit on this stage as a diversity officer in this community and talk about those classes, absolutely, that data is real. But the fact is that we have talent to deploy in every department of business, and the fact that we're not there is impacting our regional economies. That is the case that we make. But it goes deeper than that. We find that many of us don't fully understand where our problems began, and that in order to prescribe the right solution, you have to understand the right problem. The National Academy of Sciences 2 years ago began studying whether or not blacks and whites fully understood the depth of the economic challenges and racial challenges facing our country. They interviewed blacks and whites to understand, do you really understand the depths of the gap? And ask questions like those that you see on the screen. And you see some guesses there. You see for every $100 in income that a white family earns, what does a black family earn? And you see that the guesses were far off from the actual answers. The same is true when we ask those questions about wealth. And you might be telling yourself, okay, well, those are the answers that white people gave. But those are average answers. Because the reality is that it wasn't just white people who were wrong. We got those answers wrong too, because some of us move up the ladder and get far, far removed from the actual experiences of not just those people, not just our cousins, but us. Because it doesn't really matter how much you make when we talk about wealth. Us, we get confused about the actual gaps. We get confused about what does my peer actually make for the same job, for less education. In the Minneapolis, St. Paul region, Economic Policy Institute started studying us about 10 years ago and said that for African Americans, when we compared people who had a PhD, a master's degree, compared to their peers who had a high school diploma or a bachelor's degree, that they were not just in the wrong jobs. For the same job, they were being paid drastically different. So when we looked at our economy, we said, wait a minute, this isn't just a case of people who dropped out of high school. This isn't just a case of people who don't work, don't want to work, can't work. You know, the narrative we tend to portray, this is the case of racism when it comes to wages. Uh-oh. Wait a minute, we have no chance of being able to get to wealth if we have wage inequities, and wage inequities can't be solved by job training programs. Wage inequities can only be solved by taking on bias. When the National Academy of Sciences studied to say, why might we have this lack of understanding about the actual causes of this lack of understanding in what's happening, they said that Americans tend to believe that we're more equal today in places of income, wealth, wages, and health benefits. We tend to think that because we are segregated. You don't really know what's happening inside white neighborhoods, white households, their experiences. You might see what somebody drives, and so you go get that same car. But you don't know what percentage they paid for that car. You don't know what down payment they made for that car. You just went and got the same car. That car gives you an image of how much wealth do they have, how much income do they have, but it doesn't really tell you anything. So we have misperceptions about that, and vice versa. And they have misperceptions about you, your income, your wealth. Well, we're comparable. We have the same title. Not so much. We have other public images. You have a black president. You maybe have a black mayor. We have a black mayor in St. Paul we're really proud of. And that makes us feel like, okay, we've arrived. We are past the point of disparity, of inequities, because we've got people in high positions. We might have a black president of a division of a company, a black vice president. Maybe we even get a black CEO. We start to feel like we've arrived. We are past that point. We also found in this study that whites who were told, don't think about this America today. Imagine an America where racism still persists, and then answer the question. Those individuals got the answers not right, but closer to right than others who were told just to think about America as it is today. Imagine that it takes being asked to think about this country as though racism persists, instead of actually realizing that racism, it does persist. One of the other frameworks for our work causes us to be able to think about wealth and to think about all of the different efforts that have been deployed across our country in nonprofits, like the ones that many of us work in today, in foundations that are investing in this work, in government and in the private sector. And we were thrilled here recently when the Ford Foundation released an analysis of the work they had done over 20 years to invest in addressing the racial wealth gap. We wanted to look at that because our organization, while we're building on work I did with foundations across Minnesota for 5 years, the actual organization is only 2 years old. It'll be 2 years next month. And so we wanted to examine whether or not our assumptions that we're guiding this work on were built on the right things, and we're thrilled to see that we aligned really well with the lessons learned that Ford released. The first being that we need to focus on unequal wealth, not only incomes. And this one, I'm going to say a lot here today because it's critical, because for far too long we've been convinced to only focus on jobs and a little bit on income. And in the region I live in, it's almost exclusively employment. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we can even begin to work our way out of the depths of inequity by focusing there. They also found that supporting scholars and practitioners of color has helped spread awareness and clarify the challenges. This one speaks to where we place power and focus. Whose hands do we place leadership in? Today has been about African American leadership. Not just a leadership conference, not a people of color leadership conference, but African American leadership. May it forever reign. We cannot afford to be confused about who will create the solutions that will move African Americans forward in this community. It cannot be done through aggregated solutions. If it could, it would have already been done. In the region I live in, we love to feel very progressive and inclusive. I moved there 10 years ago, and it was extremely painful to find a community of people who believe themselves to be so progressive and inclusive that the data must be wrong because we've been the most progressive in the country. For years, it has to be wrong, Tawanna. No, not wrong. Bland solutions will not work. We have to put power for decision-making, power for investments, power for everything in the hands of the people who are most close to the solutions. It sounds cliche, but it actually works. They also found that making big bets on promising solutions like baby bonds and child savings accounts was paying off and smart for philanthropy. Too often, we label those things as, let's take a little risk. Let's take a big risk. I appreciate them framing this as a big bet instead of taking a risk. Let's start taking more of those risks if we're working in foundations and challenge ourselves to make them big bets. That makes putting big dollars out on the table and doing so for not just 3 years and calling that as a success because we didn't make a one-year grant, but 10 and 20 years. I was so pleased to hear the Obama Foundation say today, we may not have been here when the Empowerment Network started, but we will be here until Omaha becomes the community that it has to be for the future economy. And some popular and tested approaches do not do nearly enough to close the gap. When we say we're going to start things, we have to be also willing to say what we're going to stop because it hasn't worked. And lastly, that the racial wealth gap is a structural and historical problem, and therefore requires structural, bold solutions. So that is what we are doing in our region. We found ourselves faced with the challenge of individuals and organizations, companies who focus very heavily in charity instead of business. Having weak accountability between the private sector, nonprofits, philanthropy, and government. Having regional leaders who struggle to be able to come in and focus on particular neighborhoods, just as you have that struggle here. How do we focus on North Omaha? How do we focus on South Omaha and other neighborhoods that are having challenges at the same time that we focus on being the best possible region in the country? And we found that while innovation was occurring, we had success stories. We struggled to be able to stick with them long enough to scale them to the point that we could really claim victory over 10 and 20 years. Our solution was creating an organization that is cross-sector, that is working across all sectors, but not just elbow to elbow, but arm in arm, disrupting and leveraging market forces in order to catalyze shared prosperity and an inclusive economy. Doing that work, working at the intersections of race, place, and income, economic development, capital, transportation, and access. Because each of these things are not silos in the way that we've worked in them historically. We tend to, in our organizations, want to work in one domain or another. But you and I don't live our lives that way. We can't expect people who are the most locked out of our economy to expect us to work in those ways either. So we challenge and support organizations in all of the sectors to build their capacity to work more deeply across those lines and to measure and be accountable across those lines as well. We do that at the center, not as a direct service organization now at the ground up in communities, but really working to build the capacity of the public and private sectors to deeply disrupt practices, policies, and behaviors that produce exclusive results and replace those with new inclusive policies, practices, and behaviors, and then institutionalize them. Why? Because those two sectors have the biggest opportunity to produce gains in our communities and the greatest accountability and responsibility to do so, and the least knowledge to be able to do so and to do so at scale. We're doing that work in consultation, though, because it requires being able to build shared accountability, that there is not one of us who can do this work and do it alone, and not one of us who has the capacity and expertise to be able to do so. It requires all of us using results frameworks to be able to drive regional scale across the entire region. And in my case, we're working across a 7-county metro in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then consulting with cities across the country who call us in as necessary. But our core focus is the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and why we've driven in. What we typically get called into other regions for is this piece around data, how we drive data-informed, market-responsive, and solutions that center people of color in the middle. The indicators we released just this past spring in partnership with the Brookings Institution were the first of its kind that help cities, policymakers, decision makers at all levels start to think about measures of economic inclusion, inclusive growth, economic development, human capital, and transportation and access that historically have been either leveraged as economic development levers that focus on growth for the economy, or those levers that have focused on communities of color and people in poverty as opposites, and start to bring them in as parallels that have to be used together to move the economy forward at the same time we look at moving people of color toward wealth simultaneously. We look at these levers and then work to hold organizations and leaders accountable for moving them forward together. In our case, we work to say, how do we disaggregate these levers by race, place, and income? On our websites, you can zoom in to any neighborhood. Some of the neighborhoods you can go down to by census tract level to be able to examine the data and use that data to drive internal measurements. We looked initially at data you might expect, employment data, wage data, and saw trends that you would expect in any neighborhood across the country or community across the country that is struggling. But it's not enough to just think about wage and employment data because we tend to hear about that a lot. We also needed to consider what business ownership looked like, where loans are happening from banks in our region, not just for business ownership, but also for bricks and mortar for those businesses. Who are the loans going to? What are the loans going for? In our community, not unlike Omaha, we see business buildings going up that often sit vacant, where landlords who don't look like us can afford to get incentives and loans and then keep those buildings vacant. Meanwhile, businesses are wanting and desiring to be able to come into those buildings and infrastructure. Having the data disaggregated by place and race allows us to make that very transparent case that historically has been a narrative that can be dismissed by those who are in power. We also look at workforce development from a perspective of disaggregating what's happening from state-funded systems, what's happening at the educational level as we look at 4- and 2-year colleges, and what is driving things from a business perspective. When we released this data in April that showed that, wait a minute, our 4- and 2-year colleges are able to graduate some students, but not all students, my phone rang for the next 6 days from college presidents who all said, Tawanna, you're right. We actually know this data. We can graduate students who are immigrants, but we can only get them jobs as interns with 4-year degrees. We cannot graduate African Americans and Native Americans at all. We need help. Some of this is our fault. We've got to do a better job at being able to steer students into career pathways that give them a better opportunity. We've got to do a better job of incentivizing students and making sure that they know they really have careers. But we also have to do a better job at convincing employers to hire our students at the same rate that they hire white students with the same degrees in education. They were right, and now we're teamed up arm in arm to make the case. Having the data and having the data disaggregated and keeping it public and central is key, and that is the work that we take on. We also began examining homeownership rates and rental affordability rates and disaggregating them again, race, place, and income. And this is where things got very interesting. We often focus on affordability for rental income, and in the Twin Cities, nothing is affordable. It's interesting, as we looked at the rental affordability, it showed that nothing was affordable even for white families in the region, which drove immediate action in our space. But when we looked at home ownership, we chose to look at the share of middle-income households, those making $100,000 or more, who could afford to get loans and who were getting loans, and saw, wait just a minute. We don't see people of color, particularly African Americans, getting loans at the rate that we should expect them to get. And again, it helps that Brookings is my data partner, because this isn't about, oh, Tawanna's organization is in some back room putting out data. Not so much. So we have the availability of data, and suddenly we had bank board members calling saying, wait a minute, Tawanna, has my bank president called you? Do they know this data? What did they respond to? Do you have this data for the bank that I sit on the board of? Because this, again, is about accountability, not about programs, not about initiatives, but about accountability and driving results. The online indicators help organizations go deeper and ultimately drive us to a place for what are the actions. This is, if you go to the platform, you'll see that we elevate the solutions that different organizations throughout our entire region are driving, so that immediately, if you are committed to this work, you can connect to one of them and begin taking actions and moving our region forward. Our next level of action, though, is goal setting, because what gets measured gets done, and we have to move forward our region. We're convening community partners and residents right now in the work of setting goals through the last part of the fall and into the spring, so that by the time we get to our April summit, we will have established regional goals in at least 5 of the 14 indicators for an inclusive economy, and then we'll move to using results-based accountability and results-based leadership to gather and align the work of public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sector organizations to make sure that we are all in on moving the needle for this work. It's time out for individual solutions, it's time out for platforms and initiatives and press conferences, then it is time for the level of accountability that you've driven here, in our case, against these economic inclusion indicators that will move our region forward and move communities of color forward toward and through wealth building. I'm happy to be able to answer questions, but ultimately what I would elevate to you all is the choice is ours. How well we will step up to be able to leverage the legacy, the talent that we know is within us. There is no question. It is not simply about training us to know how. This is about really training people to know how to value the talent, the brilliance that exists within us. It is about training us to know how to value it enough to purchase from that talent when we have businesses. It is about training us to value it enough to hire, to retain, to advance enough when that brilliance is there. And it is about us being willing to step into that space and hold others accountable together, unified enough to be able to move that platform forward. We know that when we take that choice forward, people have no choice but to respond, particularly in communities like this one, where the numbers say that we can't just be the majority from a demographics perspective, but simply have to see the power dynamics move enough to cause that economy to shift and grow, if cities like Omaha, cities like Minneapolis, and cities like St. Paul want to continue to be competitive, growing, and thriving, they have to be inclusive, and inclusion starts with us. I'm thrilled to be able to be here with you. Thank you.